Now, a couple of weeks ago, I made a video discussing Disney's animation problem and went from there, where now as of today, I wanted to talk about something greater that we have seen affecting all of animation and regular live action, and that, my friends, is Disney's creativity problem. Because in recent years, as suggested by their live action remakes and endless amounts of sequels, it seems that Disney wants to play it safe with all of their properties and not do something new. The explosion of content seen in Phase 4 of Marvel and many recent shuffling Star Wars announcements prove a strong focus on properties that have already been ingrained into society for many years at this point. And that's not to say it's a bad thing. There are good things to be enjoyed about these stories of heroes and of course the galaxy far, far away, but Disney themselves have shied away from constantly pushing a creative edge for something new and unique. Gone are the days of us seeing films like Tron from the mainstream as their original live action film ideas, now replaced with hollowed remakes that add nothing of value anymore, with the new announcement of things that are totally unnecessary considering the state of their baseline animation. These are situations where they know it is easy to make money off of them because it focuses on the general audience's nostalgia that enables them to put half the effort, which all of which of course works in the case of The Lion King making $1.6 billion but having zero the value of its original and generally making things 10 times as worse. And today I just wanted to take a look back at Disney's early days and compare it to the content of now, mainly in the realms of movies of both live action and animated, and see how far Disney has fallen creatively and originality wise. When Disney started back in 1923, about 100 years ago, it began out of Walt's uncle's garage, a humble beginning where he and his brother founded its studios to produce these animated short films called the Alice Comedies, a series of short films that blended both live action and animation, which the success propelled them to do more with that animation with the creation of Oswald and moving the studio to a proper location, which of course at the time was also taken from him as the contract with Universal made them owners of that very property, thus depriving him of that very creation, but he still managed to keep going at that time. Because you see here in the early days of Disney, doing the same things wouldn't make them last forever, so only a genius like him could move on to the next big thing, as we know of with the success of Mickey Mouse that really brought Disney onto the main stage, especially the third one that most of us know so well within Steamboat Willie that propelled them into stardom. And also what came at the tail end of this decade was the production of the Silly Symphony cartoons, the shorts that were really used as a launching pad to take animation towards new heights that form the baseline of what we see today, where Walt Disney actually constantly used them as grounds for experimenting with processes, techniques, characters, and stories in order to further the art of animation. It also provided a venue to try out techniques and technologies such as Technicolor, special effects animation, and dramatic storytelling in animation that would be crucial for Disney's plans to eventually begin making feature-length animated films, all the while producing other things like the Mickey Mouse shorts where the Silly Symphonies brought in other favorite characters like Donald Duck into the fold, while Goofy was primarily shown in other Mickey Mouse shorts. And just prior to this was the release of the Three Little Pigs, where we would highlight this cartoon for its large popularity being the most successful animated short ever made, which made them produce sequels to it, the first of its kind for Disney and the only major type of sequels that Disney would actually see for a while. Because famously during this time, Walt Disney never believed in doing any sequels, a thought which the current company disregards today because he felt like after doing something as impressive as this was actually just to move on to the next big thing, to improve upon what we've learned from before and take it to a different medium. Where of course out of the popularity for the pigs, they made these ones which are actually semi-successful but not as much as the original and not towards Walt's very liking story-wise. The story wasn't as strong as the first, and of course when you watch these you can actually feel that they really didn't add much substantially to the characters. Sure, it was fun to see them again with these new characters added, but for the most part their stories were quite literally the same with nothing more from where they began and what they fit. Where the real success of this got Walt Disney to drum up support for an animated feature film instead, known as Snow White. This is something I've already discussed before in the animation video, but it still remains a crucial step that got Disney to the newer heights and the dramatic cost it actually took to make a film like this in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which was an idea the critics thought impossible and costed over $1 million to make. Definitely not chump change for the state of Disney in this era, which could have all resulted in failure where they could have been closed for good, hence why most people were vehemently against the idea of a feature animated film because no one has done that idea before. Where of course, using the technological feats of his other shorts, it did become a classic that broke the world in terms of success and animation, and instead of doing a sequel like many would demand, he instead would actually take that success and put it towards other films like Pinocchio, Fantasia, Dumbo, Bambi, all great classic Disney films from the golden age that really proved the ability that the studio was able to succeed with feature-length animated films that we all know today, but it also came at the cost of World War II happening at the same time, which also hampered their ability and forced them to produce propaganda for a short time in package films. And I think the idea during this time of package film was quite fascinating. Films that aren't definitely going to be made these days, but just a combination of different short stories into one film that was certainly interesting being made, both using live action and animation extensively, and used to keep the company afloat during these troubled times up until Cinderella, a film that also resulted in another make or break point for Disney, where its failure could have resulted in the company failing altogether, and nothing we would see here today would ever exist for better or for worse. It was one that actually returned the charm of Snow White while using techniques of live action references for its animation to make the characters look real and make the story more unique and vibrant that made it possible to expand the studio, entering television and more importantly produce Disneyland in this very decade. And during that same very year, Disney would also release their first very complete live action based film based on the novel of Treasure Island, which was not as popular as the release of Cinderella of course, but was still loved and proved Disney's ability to move beyond animation to produce something new, where this decade would also produce other classics we know today like Peter Pan, Alice in Wonderland, and Sleeping Beauty, while also one of my personal favorites of this era, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Another great success that solidified Disney's ability in live action that we would see taken to greater heights with Mary Poppins and so on. It was just that Disney actually had this innate ability to create interesting stories, whether it be animation or otherwise in television or just live action films. And I'm not going to detail the entire history of the company from here on out and explain like I did in my last video to highlight the animation, but I just wanted to highlight all of this era during Walt Disney's time alive for championing such creativity, ability to move on to a diverse range of movie storytelling into different mediums, where apart mainly from the silly symphonies, most of his work did not include any sequels and moved on to different varying projects which would remain to be the case after his death until the mid-90s came in. Because starting in the year 1990, Disney would actually produce their first major sequel titled The Rescuers Down Under, an idea that actually came from the new management of Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg after the popularity of the film dominated Disney's animation for the early 80s, where of course these two men are responsible for ushering in Disney's renaissance that we all love today and moving the company to the big heights we know of today, where of course after this movie and before it were things like The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, Lion King, and so forth, the classics that we all know today. This is where I would say the birth of Disney being the giant it really is formed, an era where they started to bring in multiple theme parks around the world, multiple classic movies and TV shows and whatnot, where of course they would start to cash in on it to the max with direct-to-DVD sequels, which I've also talked about and hated to the 10th degree. These were the movies that demonstrated, just like the Three Little Pigs, that there were really just nowhere for the stories to go just because they already achieved what they wanted to in the first, being primarily mostly there to sell toys and drum up the pilot of their animated TV shows instead of after the company was being as big as they are now. Of course, with that kind of statement, the thing that most interested them about this was the thing that drives them the most money, being something recognizable and easily to accomplish, using the old to market it as the new, with things like Alice in Wonderland acting as a sequel and live action remake to the original to really harness this new success in after they started to buy things like Pixar and Marvel into the fold. And as fun as these Tim Burton movies are and the reimagining things like Maleficent, this is where the true colors of the executives came into view and started to slowly twist the meaning of their original content to do the same thing character-wise. And the more they saw this, the more they actually liked it, with the positive success of Cinderella that really encouraged them to make a story that was vaguely similar to the original in Beauty and the Beast. Nothing vastly different, but certainly toned down to a degree from what the animation provided, and was a box office success anyway that really put in the seeds in this company's mind that animation should be rather disrespected as a medium and now as a genre that they could use to pluck any big story they find in the past towards the big screen while producing mainstream sequels to the largest revival animation in Ralph and Frozen, where of course, just like the shitty direct-to-DVDs in this instance, nothing again was remarkably added to the story, where they started to remove villains from that very story as we know of today with subsequent other Disney animation films and originals that they do. Like every new step they took, whether it be continuing the same story or rehashing it onto a different screen, this actually allowed them to remove major elements from the original for a mediocre shell because of the cash cows which they are now known to be. Like they could just do whatever they want without adding what the originals provided to us. And this problem was really shown to us when The Lion King came out on screen. I knew it before it was released that it was not going to be good, and that remained to be the case because they used the live action genre as their scapegoat to remake the same exact film that they've already did before that was animated once again, this time to be more realistic in this era, removing any emotions from the character and just a shitty nature documentary for kids to watch. This is where creativity truly died for me in this company, because they were willing to stoop to this low of a level for whatever this was meant to be to anyone, knowing that it would be a huge hit with $1.6 billion because it still rehashed the same popular story that The Lion King brought to screen, even with the knowledge that it carried half the weight to begin with. And trying to do things differently to appease certain audiences would actually result in their first failure with the likes of Mulan, now showing to the extent of the audience about what they really take away from those very stories. The creativity they tried to display from the original Mulan in this instance, removing all the magic and heart about what people loved about that particular story to begin with. So even when they're seemingly attempting to do something different, they managed to screw it up worse than it already is, because it still uses the baseline story that we've already seen and trying to appease a different market like China, which ultimately failed because they didn't understand anything about that region. And then the problem continues on with their other studios like Pixar with their terrible sequels and mediocre stories, and again in Marvel and in Star Wars. Most notably in Star Wars within the sequel trilogy that mainly rehashed the original trilogy, not particularly doing things different like the prequels did in terms of baseline story for where they wanted to go, this time going back to Rebels versus Empire into the First Order versus the Resistance by blowing up the New Republic and the government that was being built up by Return of the Jedi's ending, where of course we all know A New Hope has become The Force Awakens and so forth, where newer decisions really destroyed a lot of what the fans loved about Star Wars in the first place. This is an instance where a company now too big to fail that doesn't really understand anything about the character stories that comes into view. They try to find what best aligns to their pocketbooks instead of the very story that would come right out of it. The progression of each era that George Lucas tried to build with Anakin's story in the Fall of the Republic and the Rise of the Rebellion to restore such a thing, and seeking what actually would happen after that, where they didn't really show us that on screen in this very trilogy, making no sense with the end of Return of the Jedi that might have brought everything back, where they just destroyed that once again in this very trilogy. Disney didn't really go into this with a clear plan, or even Lucasfilm for that matter, to go into the specifics about what happened, where most of the main decisions rely on what the company wanted relating to their animation, live action, and then their big properties like Star Wars and Marvel. And the sad thing with Marvel is that they had the plan for the majority of their time with Disney, of course going back with Iron Man and Hulk being produced by other companies before Disney stepped back in 2009, where of course they allowed them to have the resources to form the Infinity Saga that everyone loved, where after that, with the introduction of things like Disney Plus, somehow they actually soured everything that we loved about that, doing too much, making the movies rely so much on the comedy and for kids, and just not the same ones we fell in love with from before. It's honestly a very baffling decision nowadays with all the things they bought to focus on this quantity rather than the quality, once again referring to the early days we discussed starting 100 years ago at this point, where we would progress to the next big thing, and now we are witnessing them regressing to the next same thing. It's not that anyone hates this because we love Marvel and Star Wars properties continuing, but they somehow fumble the bag every time and ruin what we love and seemingly are too scared to do anything very different, to relax in their old ways from moving on to the new, which doesn't make any sense with the resources that they have nowadays. Disney used to take risks where if one project failed then it would all collapse, where in modern times they become seemingly too big to fail, where if one project fails they can just pull out another one that they did 20 years ago to save that failure instead. Definitely not creative at all. I mean, in this case when one film fails it doesn't mean the death of them, but they just don't want to do anything new because one failed. I mean, why actually risk that when you have everything, when you can actually buy everything at your feet rather than depending on one big thing? Why would you ever go back to the time that Walt Disney used technology to enhance his stories when you can do what works for the rest of time while everyone else just experiments instead, with things like Spider-Verse being a prime example of a new style that Disney doesn't want to do. Their unwillingness to try is why many people are actually turning their backs on them, unable to create new stories in both animation and live action because they don't believe the money is there. Bringing us back today with Moana's live action announcement that doesn't make any sense, and the Toy Story and Frozen sequels also being announced in the fold, where we see this clear lack of intelligence or just simple ability to create such unique, diverse stories that they've had from before. The ones that change the world, whether it be in the film industry or outside of it, with a group of executives that just simply don't understand what they are just doing by riding on the coattails of ideas that existed 100 years ago rather than trying to perfect it for something new. And like I said, that's not to say I haven't been able to enjoy this. There have been many technological leaps and interesting stories that I love out of these various franchises franchise, but they really refuse to do something more creative work other than these soulless live-action adaptations and sequels that don't really have real stories to provide to the viewer and only worsen the message that they've had originally. Like, it is really creatively bankrupt, and multiple people are just tired of it all, feeling done with what they have done. And I really hate it. I hate it that people are turning their backs on some of the properties like Star Wars because some are just downright petty individuals that make it their job to be upset at this every day, even when they can create something unique. And I just hate that this is the company I actually aspire to grow up working for myself, to become CEO myself one day, where I would want to continue such creative legacy of my very idol Walt Disney himself. Like, it really doesn't make any sense when you have the resources that Walt would have actually killed for to have back in the day to make something fresh and new, expanding his parks and his ideas for the future of society into the fold, where they just can't find themselves doing because they're just too cowardly to make anything that would definitely bring drastic changes to the entire world. But as much as I would like to continue talking about this topic, I just feel, like Disney in this case, so bankrupt out of any idea to continue talking about the same thing in the past few videos about why this is bad or why this doesn't work, and I just want to make more positive videos for a change. Just simply getting this scratching itch out of my way about the primary focus of this company that is just trying to be safe and making everything worse rather than making it better, and I really want it to change. I want to hope for a better future, but I doubt Disney is capable of doing so right now or in the next 20 years. But with that said, I guess it's just time just to move on and see what will happen next within the newer movies, whether it be truly original or straight up boring ass remakes that will drag this company to hell. And it's just up to me to provide something new for all of you guys to talk about. So I'm all done, so goodbye.